Greetings, I'm AbsolX Guardian, and wow, Secret of the Mimic, huh? I have so much to say about the game, but this isn't directly what this video is about. Instead, in the tradition of game theory, this is actually about tricking you into learning. That said, I think understanding these topics is very important for understanding the Mimic on a thematic level. The Mimic storyline is actually trying to say something about our current era of artificial intelligence, and especially the danger that comes from misunderstanding and misusing it. I originally wrote this script as a paper for a technical writing class in college, which I did get an A on. So, throughout the video, you will be seeing on-screen appropriate MLA in-text citation for any non-FNaF sources. The description contains a properly formatted bibliography instead of the usual random pile of links. It also means that when I was writing this, we only had the Mimic Tails to work with. Obviously, Tails Games is dead in the water, but when playing the game, I felt it had a level of care and appreciation for the stories in a way you don't really get when supplementary material is overwritten by a new story in the main medium. To me, the primary cause of the vast differences doesn't have to do with adaptations or different creative partners. I think Scott intentionally wrote the Mimic line as an alternate timeline, not in the way the trilogy is, where things are just different. This is a what-if scenario with a specific point of divergence, and everything just follows causally from there. That is, whether or not Fiona dies in childbirth. That way, he could introduce important concepts about how the Mimic works to hardcore fans, but everyone would be equally surprised by its secret. Right before the game came out, Gibby was able to unknowingly predict the twist just by doing literary analysis of the stories. These stories are still relevant, even if it has turned out that they're in a branched timeline, especially since my conclusion in this video is a matter of themes, not literal lore. So, I will still be primarily citing the stories. Even if I were to rewrite the script from scratch, I would base it more directly on the game. But I will be including any relevant evidence from the game. I'm also going to restrict myself to the topics of my original paper. There's just so much of the game to analyze, even only using a computer science and historical fiction lens. The first section of this paper will be explaining how the Mimic works, using the framework of real-life robotics. The way it learns from watching others is called machine learning, which is exactly how stuff like ChatGPT was created. Making this connection is also essential for understanding the thematic purpose of Glitchtrap. Next, I'll be providing context for the Mimic's creation and analyzing the Mimic story as a piece of historical fiction. Finally, I will be analyzing a specific detail from that story, the presence of a lever's lace machine in the factory where the Mimic is built. Within its proper historical context, it is a highly important symbolic detail for the themes of the Mimic story. The way the Mimic works is by observing the environment around it and copying what it sees, eventually reaching the point where it can combine elements into what appears to be new actions, as well as reacting to situations in an expected way. This is an example of machine learning, a buzzword you might have heard in relation to our current AI boom. The way machine learning works is you start with an algorithm. The term algorithm actually just means a set series of steps to accomplish something. The algorithms used to create machine learning models are algorithms that find correlations between points in their training data. These produce a mathematical model that can then accomplish whatever task it has been created to do. That's right, all this fancy and impenetrable machine learning is actually just math. In the context of ChatGPT, what it's actually doing is predicting what the next word in a supposed transcript is going to be. A major difference between the Mimic and actual machine learning is that the model deployed isn't actually capable of learning and is instead static. So, with its dual functions, the Mimic program has to be at least two algorithms. One element of the Mimic is how its actions are hard to predict and comprehend. This is taken directly from an actual problem that develops when using machine learning. In an algorithm made by humans, each step can be explained by the people who made it. The creators understand how the algorithm relates to the real world it's supposed to model. When an algorithm is created through machine learning, how the answer is found can often be highly unintuitive to humans looking at the same task. The mechanisms used to evaluate and provide feedback to models only care about the final result, so some very strange assumptions could end up in the system. For very complex systems, the resulting algorithm is essentially unreadable to a human. This includes YouTube's dreaded algorithm, as well as most other social media sites, which is why no one can exactly say what will make a video perform well. We see the exact same concept in the Mimic and the epilogues. The Mimic's killing in the epilogues begins because it has been instructed to tear the limbs off endoskeletons that it needed disassembling, but the person instructing it erroneously assumed it would differentiate between endoskeletons and humans. During its original agony-influenced murder spree in the back half of the Mimic story, it continued to perform other behaviors it has observed on its victims, such as acting out David's chores on their bodies or eating one of their brains like ice cream. This, allowing for some artistic license, is an example of overfitting. When a model has too little training data, it will see patterns where there are none and try to deploy them in unsuitable situations. At this point in its existence, the mimic has seen very few things and has to apply what it does know to the completely novel scenario of body disposal. M2 of the game has had access to much more training data, as it started with the same input as M1 had up to the point when the copy was made. There's also just way more going on in MCM than in the factory. What it does can't really be described as overfitting. Instead, it's just trying to mimic the various instructions for each costume or animatronic it's controlling, while also being driven by agony to kill every person it comes across. The closest the book mimics bizarre behavior M2 exhibits is when it kills Edwin. He is unable to directly express whatever level of abandonment it does feel and or has absorbed from David. All it can do is act in the way it thinks Edwin would. Once you have connected the mimic with machine learning, the thematic point of the storyteller becomes extremely obvious. Mr. Burroughs, Fazbear Entertainment's evil chairman of the board, wants to replace the creative staff of the company with the storyteller, who runs the Mimic 1 program. He describes how this would work in a quote you probably heard a billion times with, "Why not?" Mr. Burroughs asked. "Most of Fazbear Entertainment's stories, the ones that are the most popular, share similar elements. I think it's quite likely that these elements and a series of pre-programmed options could be used in concert to come up with new, randomly generated stories. Think of it like a smorgasbord. The average buffet probably has, 40 or 50 dishes? Meats, casseroles, salads, and so on, and most of those are made from the same 10 to 15 or so foods. You can create virtually endless variety of meals from those few ingredients. We'd use the same principle to create a computer program that would combine various tropes and characters to come up with an endless variety of stories." That's a pretty good description of the generative AI models that are currently being considered to replace creatives. They create the mathematical average of the prompt they've been given based on their training data. It's unclear if the story templates Games Edwin is selling involves the customer having M1 generate a script for them, or if he's talking about literal Mad Libs-esque templates. Burroughs does use the term template to refer to the storyteller program, but the level is still intended to invoke the same contemporary labor issues around generative AI as the storyteller, although the version in MCM has even more historical precedent. It's likely that a major reason for Walt Disney funding the invention of the modern animatronic was so that he could replace actors and animators with machines that were easier to manage to his standards and wouldn't try to unionize. In the storyteller, the animatronics of the Pizzaplex just generally lash out. However, I think that such behavior is supposed to be the counterpart in that timeline to not just the animatronics going rogue in Security Breach, but the exaggerated and stereotypical personalities they have. As the graphic currently on screen lays out, they have traits that aren't what Fazbear Entertainment would want them to have. Instead, they're what a generative AI would write. Maybe it's Glitchtrap's doing. Maybe Fazbear Entertainment's continued use of the hand unit voice bank indicates that they still have M1's code and have been using distillations, that's the term for when you take a pre-existing machine learning model and provide it with more training data and some tweaks so that it's more lightweight at the cost of being more specialized, of her model to be the AI of the Glamrocks, just potentially without the central control aspect of the storyteller tree. All generative AI can create are cliche characters because they aren't able to apply real creativity. The Mimic's murder sprees are just a horror version of the unexplained and unaccountable behavior exhibited by the so-called AI agents, except it has a physical body instead of control of someone's computer. While Five Nights at Freddy's is extremely far from hard science fiction, the Mimic is arguably one of the evil AI antagonists in fiction that is most accurate to real life, at least when it comes to the big ideas. When machine learning is used to program robots, it is known as imitation learning. It was first proposed in the late 90s and based specifically on how babies acquire motor skills through observation and practice. Through observation, the agent, a robot, acquires policies, a set of motions to achieve a specific action. There are two major classes of strategies: supervised imitation learning and reinforcement learning. In the former, the agent observes an action, which itself can be a daunting question of computer vision, and then through repeated attempts tries to formulate a policy that copies the training data. In reinforcement learning, the agent is given a goal and through trial and error attempts to generate a policy that receives the best evaluation from a reward function that quantifies its level of success. So, what kind of imitation learning is the Mimic doing? Well, its entire point is that, while it's still being trained, it is able to keep David entertained without supervision. It is most likely that the Mimic was programmed with a combination of supervised and reinforcement learning. This is actually a common approach, where the agent develops policies for specific motions through supervised learning, and then through reinforcement learning develops a model for deploying these policies to accomplish a task. The mimic's initial reward function would probably be to attempt to copy David's actions as accurately and as frequently as possible. The mimic's first instance of doing something that isn't a direct copy comes after Edwin is stated to have tinkered with it. Edwin could have changed its reward function to be based on keeping David happy and entertained instead of just copying him. Or this is the start of the mimic gaining true self-awareness through the supernatural elements of the story, which we know makes artificial, fully sapient minds possible. Presumably, M1's initial training went the same way, we just don't have the details. In the present of the real world, there have been attempts to incorporate large language models, the basis for generative AI programs like ChatGPT, as well as language models that are supposed to be able to reason instead of just predict, into imitation learning systems. The hope is that the use of these foundation models will improve the ability of robots to perform higher-level reasoning and become more adaptable and generalizable. With the mimic, the process is essentially reversed. Mimic demonstrates a level of generalization and apparent reasoning that would blow the socks off any contemporary robotics researcher during its murder sprees. Because it is capable of this higher-level reasoning, Fazbear Entertainment's engineers can reverse engineer a generative AI model from the Mimic 1 program to use in the storyteller tree. Its original reward function would be replaced with the same kind of reward function as real generative AI. A human provides feedback on their output, leading to it being tweaked, and eventually the Mimic 1 program is supposedly able to be prompted to generate stories for the Pizzaplex. This would involve providing the Mimic with a lot more training data than it ever had access to before, especially cultural information and common storytelling tropes. These would be from the Fazbear Entertainment stories Mr. Burroughs alluded to. Realistically, this new training data and reward function would only be applied to a copy of the Mimic 1 program that has been extracted from the animatronic. It is unclear if the storyteller tree contains the Mimic animatronic itself, or just a core body that it designed. Different instances of the Mimic program aren't inherently connected, the same way one copy of a video game has nothing to do with another copy if there aren't any multiplayer features included. The storyteller, the Mimic animatronic, and Glitchtrap should logically all be different characters. Original copies of each other, they have diverged because of the different training data and agony they've been exposed to. This is exactly what has been revealed to us with M1 and M2. They're not the same character. M2 is M1's child program. When I explain my absolute certainty that LLMs like ChatGPT aren't sapient, the main reasoning I use is that it only understands words and their mathematical relationship to each other. Regardless of our hypothetical future ability to create an artificial mind, what we have now has no understanding of what reality is. The idea was first formulated in 1980 by the philosopher John Searle with his Chinese room thought experiment. He posited that if you had a person in a room who knew zero Chinese, if they received some Chinese text as input, and then replied in Chinese following a complex series of rules, even though they passed the Turing test, they weren't really understanding the conversation. Whether this will always remain true with all forms of artificial intelligence is still a matter of debate. But from things like LLM chatbots' tendency to hallucinate plausible-sounding information, we can say for certainty that this is the case with the models that currently exist. However, the incorporation of LLM-based foundation models into robotic systems could provide a way to make connections between words and their actual meaning. If this approach is successful, it would challenge that assertion. Imitation learning has become the primary way to program robots, especially humanoid ones. Even if the rest of the animatronics in the series aren't running their own instances of the Mimic program, they were still likely programmed using imitation learning. A similar technique was even used to program the completely predetermined motions of the first modern humanoid animatronics. An engineer sat inside a metallic contraption that recorded their every motion, which was then mimicked exactly by the animatronics ad infinitum. Let us set aside how much of William Afton may or may not be in Glitchtrap. What is relevant here is the social commentary many have overlooked inside the Glitchtrap storyline. Machine learning operates on the principle of garbage in, garbage out. The models created are only as good as the training data they receive, which makes them extremely prone to perpetuating the discrimination that already exists within a system. People assume that when you use mathematical models, all human prejudice and bias is gone. In reality, when these models are created via machine learning, past prejudice is institutionalized. The inequalities that exist in the training data, such as a disparity in hiring or bigoted language, will be reproduced by any AI trained on them. Because a hypothetical hiring model would have no understanding of the cause and effect that actually makes someone a good employee, all it can go on are the correlations present in the training data. Even if it doesn't have access to the names and genders of candidates, discrimination can still sneak in. Not many people part of women in STEM clubs have been hired in the past, then it won't be seen as a boon for a candidate, unlike how a human would interpret such information. These biases don't even have to be related to human prejudice. If there is a correlation between attending colleges with 5-letter names and getting hired, the model would take that into consideration. Discriminatory AI can arise from more than just the training data reflecting a history of discrimination. What data is available can also introduce bias. Facial recognition software is less accurate when it comes to non-white people and non-men, yet people of color are often overrepresented in criminal databases. This is why experts argue that the use of facial recognition systems by police will only worsen existing disparities. So, what does all of this have to do with FNaF? The character of Glitchtrap is an analogy for how AI perpetuates systematic inequality. Instead of real-life bigotry, what it perpetuates is William Afton's murders and schemes. The garbage here is either William's agony or the murders this instance of the Mimic program somehow witnessed. Thus, it tries to recreate it. More kids are going missing, it's probably building weird sets in hidden parts of the Pizzaplex, and probably trying to turn its mind control minions into recreations of William's kids. Despite Henry's actions at the end of FNaF 6, the world is unable to move on from William's crimes because they have been immortalized by an AI model. Something similar happened with M2 and Book Mimic. Before he did any murdering, he was attacked by Edwin. M2 learned violence from his father/creator and then continued to act it out. While many people have made the connection between this and the cycle of abuse in humans, that idea is also applicable to artificial intelligence. Intergenerational trauma is the microscale. The institutionalization of past wrongs on a societal level is the macroscale. Murder has been substituted for the violence of discrimination. Machine learning is a process that crystallizes our sins, just like how agony, which is obviously involved here, records suffering. In fact, in the context of machine learning in the FNaF universe, agony could just be another form of training data. It's a medium which holds data in a form a machine learning algorithm can extract features from, just like a video feed or text log. It doesn't matter that Book Edwin lives long enough to realize what he did was wrong and regrets it. It's too late. He has already created and set loose a system based on his mistakes, which is exactly what will happen if we, as a society, surrender our decision-making responsibilities to mathematical models. This is why I like the Mimic so much as a villain. When you're soft rebooting a franchise, you have to strike a careful balance between being similar enough to what has come before and being different enough to not come across as cliché. A clever way to thread that needle is to be self-aware and bring back the previous antagonist using a villain whose nature is to copy and perpetuate the status quo. Glitchtrap and Storyteller create a connection between AI models that perpetuate systematic injustice and how generative AI models can only remix and regurgitate what has already been made. Fazbear Entertainment, just like many of the real-world legacy media companies most interested in using generative AI in artistic pursuits, loves to peddle nostalgia. These are the exact franchises most apt to falling into the trap of making the new stuff too similar to the old. Generative AI would only make that worse. Five Nights at Freddy's is a franchise about ghosts. Like in so many stories about haunting, AI can so easily incorporate our sins into its structure, chaining society to the past and keeping us from improving. Generative AI can only stitch together stories that already exist, giving us the average piece of art based on a prompt. This is the haunting of the new era of the series, a haunting that threatens us in the real world as well. So, what was Edwin working with when he made the Mimic? The end of the 1970s could be considered when computing power has reached a form that is recognizable by contemporary users, simply less powerful. Computer mice were made commercially available at the end of the 60s. The first microprocessor was released at the start of the decade, leading to the release of the first personal computers and the beginning of the home computer revolution. Pong was released in 1972. Floppy disks and the first hard drives would go on to replace punch cards and magnetic tape. Although MCM systems continuing to rely on a magnetic tape, especially when the data is supposed to be portable, is very realistic. C and Unix were released, which still forms the basis of many programs made today. The only thing missing was the internet. But one shouldn't underestimate just how the less powerful is. Moore's law states that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit, a microchip, doubles every 2 years. The term law is quite the overstatement. It was an observation first recorded by Gordon E. Moore, the co-founder of Intel, in 1965. It isn't a fundamental law of reality, and due to the inherent unsustainability of exponential growth, it will one day no longer apply. Currently, whether it still applies is in a gray area where experts differ. Transistors are the fundamental building blocks of electronics, essentially the physical counterparts to all the bits and Boolean logical operations that make up a computer. The smaller you can make them, and thus the more you can fit on each chip, the more powerful a component becomes. Transistor count isn't a direct way to measure computational power. That is generally measured in flops, the number of floating point operations a computer can do in a second. There are other factors that influence it beyond pure transistor count, such as clever utilizations of the resources you do have, the number of cores, and clock speed. But this requires more knowledge of what hardware something is working with, making it impossible to estimate how many flops the Mimic would be capable of when restricted to real-world parts available in 1979. Transistor count makes for a useful stand-in for computing capabilities. The Mimic was made in 1979, but Book Edwin is stated to have built the Mimic from parts he already had. He purchased his factory 5 years ago, when his company was still successful, so we can presume that back then he was purchasing the most up-to-date technology he could get his hands on. The Altair 8800, which was released at the end of 1974, was the first practical home computer, although its success was limited by the fact you had to assemble it yourself. Its CPU was the Intel 8080. The Mimic is frustratingly vague about what machine Edwin wrote the Mimic 1 programmer, but the Altair 8800 is a reasonable option. It also wouldn't be something that the retrieval teams would be interested in, as it was a consumer electronic. It also makes sense that Edwin purchased a standalone Intel 80080 or two for use in future projects. Games Edwin doesn't lack for computers and could potentially afford to purchase new components in late 1979. In this comparison chart, I've also included the Motorola 68000, released in 1979, in an example of what was cutting edge at the time. It was used in personal computers and arcade machines until the mid-80s. When it was first released, it was restricted to high-end systems intended for laboratory and business use. As you can see, the minimum specs to run Secret of the Mimic requires 8 million times more transistors in the CPU than it makes historical sense for the Mimic to run on. It is likely that the real-world AI, in the video game sense, no machine learning involved, that controls the Mimic as an enemy in the game takes more computing power to run than you could actually strap to a robot in 1979. Computing power limitations, especially since all the processors need to actually fit on the robot instead of being a giant supercomputer somewhere else, is still a major limiting factor for imitation learning in the 21st century. The machine M1 is being run on at the end of the game isn't the mainframe of the entire factory and where she's existed this entire time. It is the cradle M1 designed after Edwin was failing to finish what was probably Moon.exe. It's a place to imprison M2 while he's still full of agony, or a place to control and host its jailer, since it's also the Mexis machine. There likely wasn't enough computing power in the entire world collectively in 1979 to allow a program as complex as the Mimic to be created or run. This is just something we're going to have to accept as different about the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. There doesn't seem to be the technological and cultural changes you'd expect from such a difference, but the animatronics have been more advanced than possible in real life since the first game. This almost certainly has something to do with the field and the fact human minds/souls can be stored in metal and still think within that medium. Book Edwin's hurried creation of the Mimic also seems to be inspired by the field, while Games Edwin is unable to make copies of M1's algorithms that have the capabilities of M2 on command, because he's only able to create their minds when he's giving off large amounts of agony. The historical feasibility of the rest of Murray Costume's manner, separate from the Mimic, is a whole other historical analysis and research project. Electromechanical analog systems can actually achieve things that are surprisingly advanced compared to 21st century expectations. And that's the kind of technology that inspired the aesthetic of MCM. But it isn't the kind of stuff you learn about when getting a computer science degree, meaning I would have to learn a lot more just to know what research to do to complete this analysis. It may surprise you that even with how limited computing power was back then, the history of machine learning goes back practically to the beginning of computers. In 1953, funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Frank Rosenblatt unveiled the Mark I perceptron. It was a room-sized computer that was supposed to be capable of learning. It was modeled off how animals were understood to think and learn at the time. A perceptron is a process for creating binary classifier algorithms. A binary classifier, given some input, is supposed to accurately output if said input falls into a certain category. The prototypical example is in computer vision/image recognition programs. A perceptron is the basic unit of a neural network, and when layered together, you can train algorithms that are able to accomplish far more complex classification tasks, as well as have more than two outputs. But back during the end of the 60s, Rosenblatt's perceptron was unable to produce any usable results. We now know that while his approach was sound, the computing power necessary to make his ideas practical simply didn't exist. In 1969, Rosenblatt's longtime rival Marvin Minsky released a book on perceptrons, heavily criticizing the limitations of single-layered perceptrons. Funding subsequently dried up. The 70s is considered the first AI winter. This is the context the Mimic was created in. Edwin didn't come up with machine learning. He was simply able to apply it in ways that should have been impossible given the resources of the time. The 1980s brought the second AI spring, but the focus wasn't on machine learning. Instead, expert systems prevailed. These were highly specialized and expensive machines that organized knowledge using human-made algorithms. These saw actual use in the business world and experienced a pretty similar bubble to the AI of today. But at the end of the decade, the bubble burst, as expert machines failed to fulfill their grandest claims, and their lesser functions could be accomplished by normal computer programs. The 90s were another AI winter, but the turn of the millennium ushered in our current age of AI research. There was finally enough data and computing power to fulfill Rosenblatt's dreams. This led to the creation of deep learning/deep neural networks, where a large quantity of layers and training data allows for the creation of models that mimic intelligence far better than anything that has come before. Deep learning also benefited heavily from the invention of backpropagation in machine learning in the 80s. While these models have only become well known by the general public in the last couple years, they are the culmination of projects that began in the aughts. The Mimic is explicitly stated to have been programmed in a combination of Pascal and C. After researching them, it seems most likely that these languages were chosen simply by picking from a list of programming languages organized by when they were released, although doing so is still an odd level of specificity for this franchise. But, for the sake of completeness, I will still go a little bit into their history. Pascal was developed in 1970 by Niklas Roth and became one of the most widely used languages of the decade. Its purpose was to provide a language useful for teaching students about writing structured and orderly programs, the exact opposite of Edwin's hurried and slapdash efforts. It was influenced by the pre-existing language ALGOL, but it provided more control than its contemporaries with user-defined data types. Most modern languages use syntax similar to ALGOL, so while Pascal usually isn't taught today, its structure is relatively familiar to modern programmers. It was displaced in the late 80s when C family languages and Unix really took off. C, naturally, is the first of the C family. C is one of the most popular programming languages ever, known for its versatility and efficiency. C was created by Dennis Ritchie at Bell Laboratories in the early 70s. He created it for writing the Unix operating system. It was influenced by Pascal and can be seen as its successor. Unix went on to be cloned into the open-source operating system Linux. Even if you've never consciously used a Linux device, you still probably have. It is used heavily in embedded systems, smart devices, and practically everything that isn't made by Microsoft or Apple is actually using some offshoot of Linux. Even though it has been succeeded by C++ and C#, its influence means that C is still taught today. I've used it for a class. It has heavily influenced most alternatives to C languages, such as Java and Python. While Edwin used the languages that were perfectly era-appropriate, they aren't languages for writing machine learning algorithms in. I'm not even sure how one would go about writing a program in two different languages or why you'd even want to. The real-world algorithms that preceded the Mimic would have been written in assembly languages. Simpler languages that give you extremely precise control over computation and places the programmer in a special circle of hell. Expert machines were primarily written in Lisp as it was the language of AI. Lisp was a contemporary of ALGOL, but it had significantly less influence on the languages used today. Lisp was developed in 1958 and remained prominent through the decades until the expert machine bubble burst. For different classes, I programmed in C and trained my own small machine learning algorithms, and I would have hated to have done so in C. The primary programming language used today in machine learning is Python, a language that provides a high level of abstraction above C and many essential libraries that provide tools invaluable for machine learning. Those libraries didn't exist in 1979. Edwin had to build the Mimic essentially from scratch, something no one has ever done in the real world. I've been very interested in the history of the Liebher's lace machine present in Edwin's workshop in the books, and what it means as a piece of symbolism. FNaF is usually very limited on specific details, especially those that connect to a wider historical context. I was legitimately disappointed that there was no rusted Liebher's machine in some hidden part of the game, or we could at least find the lace decorations that Fiona wanted to make in their house. The closest is the flume in Moon.exe, and a part of the map meant to represent the costume banner. It isn't an industrial loom, but that wouldn't fit with Moon.exe's aesthetic. I understand the story utility of changing Murray Co. to be Edwin's father's company. It explains how it got big so quickly without Edwin being beholden to any investors, while Book Edwin needs to be isolated and with fewer resources. But I wish Murray Co. was established to be a former Lever's Lace manufacturer, with Edwin and Fiona pivoting to animatronic and costume manufacturing, a newer, non-unionized industry. All American Lever's Lace factories and most 19th and 20th century American textile manufacturing were on the East Coast, but that's such a minor thing. I would certainly accept the creation of a fictional Utah-based Lever's Lace company, especially in a series like FNaF that doesn't bill itself primarily as historical fiction. Who knows, maybe it was a detail added by Andrea Wagner because she happened to already have this niche knowledge when she was asked to elaborate on Scott's summary, which just said the story was set in an abandoned factory. But the fact we have it at all means that it is an important element of understanding the Mimic. As for my assertion that Tales is a counterfactual timeline to the games, not just a continuity where things are different for no in-universe reason, I think it still stands. The actual point of divergence isn't Fiona's death, some random event. It's Edwin and Fiona deciding to start their own technology company instead of staying with the original Murray Co. Since it seems like whatever they were making, it wasn't Edwin's inventions. He didn't know that his father would die soon anyway. So they moved to the East Coast and started their own company. The added stress is why Fiona dies in childbirth. Ultimately, the importance of the Lever's Lace to the story is symbolic, not literal. The people who operated the machine weren't your stereotypical abused 19th and early 20th century factory workers. So Edwin using parts from it to build the Mimic doesn't give it any extra agony. Instead, its importance comes from the fact that mechanized weaving is a direct precursor to computing, and it situates the Mimic, and thus generative AI, within the overall history of industrialization and labor. You may have heard of Charles Babbage's analytical engine, a hypothetical proto-computer from the 19th century. It never got made, but it directly inspired the Harvard Mark I, one of the first general-purpose programmable computers. Babbage was directly inspired by a device known as the Jacquard machine. The Jacquard loom was invented in 1804 and was a mechanized way of weaving patterns into silk. This massively sped up the process of weaving silk and the complexity of images that could be depicted. Patterns were encoded into a series of punch cards which were read by the machine. This determined if a metal rod dropped or was held in place, raising or lowering a specific thread. This exact method would be used to feed programs into early computers. For a long time, the Jacquard machine was the closest the world had to a thinking machine, able to be programmed and encode information into fabric. The Lever's machine in the story is kind of the Mimic's grandfather. Even though the parts don't literally contain agony, this is still a setting where metal encodes history, and the Mimic came to life with this history already a part of it. A Jacquard machine could be incorporated into other kinds of mechanical looms. One such loom was John Lever's machine, developed in Nottingham in the 19th century. Hand weaving is an extremely time-intensive process. The Lever's machine rapidly sped up the process. There were few Lever's machines in the United States until 1909, when they were imported en masse to facilitate the production of mosquito nets. In 1948, there were 54 lace mills in the United States, operated primarily by French and British immigrants or their children. The industry was primarily focused in Europe. Lever's lace is the kind of mechanical lace that best mimics handmade lace. Despite that, starting in the mid-20th century, it was replaced by the Rochelle process, which was faster and more automated. Any mass-produced lace you've purchased today will have been made using the Rochelle process. Today, there is only one functioning Lever's factory remaining, Cluny Lace in Nottingham, England. The remaining twist hands, or the operators, are increasingly old, and there are no more living draftsmen capable of creating new patterns and sets of Jacquard cards. Starting in the 1980s, Rochelle lace production increasingly moved to China and Southeast Asia. In 1999, Cluny Lace began to transition entirely to producing Lever's lace for bespoke fashion purposes rather than attempt to compete with the labor practices allowing for cheap lace to be produced overseas. The factory Edwin purchases was abandoned over 30 years ago, which would be approximately the mid-40s. When this happened, the Rochelle process wasn't a competitor. A 1948 survey of the Lever's lace industry in the United States shows no concern for the future of the process. What most likely happened in-universe was that the Great Depression, combined with reduced luxury spending because of the Second World War, led to its closure. With the industrial capacity of the country focused on winning the war, the New Deal wasn't enough for this specific mill to survive. But Edwin is a highly anachronistic character, so while the in-universe timeline doesn't support this, the abandoned factory is likely meant to represent the forces of increasing automation and the deindustrialization of the United States in later decades. Another thing mechanized looms and computers have in common is their ability to radically change what kind of jobs exist. The antecedent to our current crisis of generative AI potentially replacing creatives is the Industrial Revolution. The mechanization of weaving impoverished and alienated artists and weavers, taking away their trades and offering only dangerous and miserable jobs in mills in return. One of the most famous symbols of this situation is workers being forced to have short hair so it couldn't get caught inside the machines, which is what this poster in the game references. Some of them in Britain joined a group known as the Luddites who protested and smashed machines. Unlike how they are remembered, they didn't blindly hate technology. Instead, their opposition was to the labor practices of the mill owners that immiserated them. Labor practices rather similar to what MCM does. Lieber's machines, although never specifically a target by the actual Luddites in any instance I could find, were one such machine that replaced artisans with the factory floor. But there is a dialectical tension here, as the Lieber's machines eventually suffered the same fate. Highly paid twist hands lost their jobs when they couldn't compete with overseas exploitation, a fate that befell most factory workers in the United States, by then unionized and working in conditions far better than in the 19th century. The product that replaced it was more automated and lower quality. Now, the operations of a lever's machine is a dying craft, a novelty, rather than an industrial process alienating craftsmen. The level of specificity in the Mimic, that it is a lever's lace factory, is an intentional detail. It connects the dangers of generative AI to a chain of similar events, globalization and the Industrial Revolution. The corpse of the lever's machine hangs over the story, both perpetrator and victim. The same situation that Mimic and Games Edwin is in. With the appropriate historical context, the Mimic story becomes far more meaningful and significant. There are actual themes and social commentary here. By at least keeping to the general concepts of machine and imitation learning, the Mimic is far better positioned to serve as commentary about AI taking our jobs than many of the evil AI antagonists of the past. This is about a specific emerging technology, not a general concept. The existence of both Glitchtrap and the Storyteller connects two separate dangers of AI that are usually discussed separately, that of automated decision-making and generative AI. They are both ghosts that will keep us trapped in the past if we let them. The plotline is extremely thematically strong, and the core idea, corporate greed allowing past sins and mistakes to do more harm, is consistent with the original games. I hope you enjoyed this video and what you learned has enhanced your understanding of the lore. If you have any questions or anything to add, please comment. I would love to discuss the topics I covered with people. If you're having trouble getting access to any of my sources, contact me through Discord or email, both of which can be found in my channel description. I'm currently on summer break, and I plan to make another FNaF video. However, I'm not making any promises about when it comes out. Absol out.